There he is.
Hello.
Hi, Theo.
You're going to be famous, dude.
Yes, it's about to happen. Welcome to Slate School's Idea Lab and tonight's conversation about deeper learning with Sarah Fine and Jal Mehta. Slate School is committed to excellence in education, and we are delighted to present the Education Idea Lab, which is a unique virtual series that is free and open to the public. This thought-leading event convenes leaders, change makers, and really participants from all sectors of education and innovation. So thank you so much for joining us. We're thrilled to have all of you with us here today. My name is Julie Mountcastle, and I am head of school at Slate School. So I'll briefly introduce you to Slate School, and then we'll hear from our extraordinary guests. Slate School is an independent 501c3 nonprofit elementary school where education is focused on cultivating creativity, fostering ingenuity, and inspiring a deep passion for lifelong learning. So at Slate School, we have formed a community that is constantly striving to improve practice, to create meaningful educational experiences for learners of all ages, really, and to change the landscape in education. So Slate School convenes experts for important, authentic conversations about education, and these online dialogues, just like tonight's, are free and open to the public. We're so happy to have all of you with us this evening. We actually have learners joining us from 6 continents. Tonight's conversation with Sarah Fine and Jal Mehta is one that our viewers have looked forward to so much, and we have received some amazing questions from our community for them. We would invite you to submit additional questions as comments on Facebook, and we will select some of those questions to ask the guests today too. So about our guests. Jal Mehta and Sarah Fine are the co-authors of In Search of Deeper Learning, The Quest to Remake the American High School. Jal is a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and he has written extensively on what it takes to improve American education. I'd say with a particular focus on the professionalization of teaching. Sarah Fine is an educator and ethnographer, and she currently directs the High-Tech High Graduate School of Education's Teaching Apprenticeship program. That's hard to say. And also serves as a lecturer in education studies at the University of California, San Diego. Jal Mehta is also the author of The Allure of Order, High Hopes, Dashed Expectations, and the Troubled Quest to Remake American Schooling, and the co-editor of Futures of School Reform. He is co-editor of the Learning Deeply blog at Education Week. He is also the winner of the Morningstar Teaching Award at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Sarah Fine holds a Doctor of Education in Culture, Communities, and Education from Harvard University Graduate School of Education, and a Master's in Education in Education Policy and Management from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So golly, we are really fortunate to have you both here with us tonight. So welcome. Can you introduce us to your associate there, Jal?
This is Theo. This is real life. Theo is 14 months old, and this is the period between when his babysitter leaves and his mom comes home. We tried to enlist the 7 and 10-year-olds as babysitters, but failed. So he's going to be joining us for the next little bit.
Well, that's great. We enjoyed that here. I was sharing with Sarah before you came on that the founder of Slate School, Jennifer Clark, has an 18-month-old daughter. So she is often with us during the day. And as a person who has children 20 and 22, it's just really nice to see the younger faces. It's a really great thing. So thanks to you both for coming tonight. I just want to get started because I think so many people they would like to have, really valuable partnerships with other people that they work with, and yet those can look a whole lot of different ways. They can emerge in different ways, and I just wonder if you would share with everyone sort of how you work together. What does your collaboration look like?
Hey, Sarah, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Especially because Theo sounds like he needs something. Yeah, I can start maybe with how Jal and I sort of formed our collaboration in the first place, which was I had been a teacher in DC and had kind of run away to grad school with a whole lot of questions about the type of schooling that I had experienced as a novice teacher in the early 2000s. So I was very much coming from the world of practice and sort of on the ground, very interested in teaching and learning, pedagogy, curriculum, school design. And Jal was, I think at the time, just emerging from a postdoc. He was a junior professor at Harvard Graduate School, trained as a sociologist. And what drew us together, because we had quite different backgrounds, was number one, we had very complementary kind of skill sets, right? Like I knew practice really deeply, Jal knew theory and policy really deeply. So it felt like we actually had a kind of like complementary set of skills. But we both had this sense, this was like 2009, if I'm remembering right, Jal, that something had gone really wrong with No Child Left Behind, and that although there were some positives that had come out in terms of focusing on equity and making sure that we were paying careful attention to subgroup performance, that there was really something missing from the conversation about what schooling could be at its best, and kind of like a lack of kind of inspiration and looking to the best of what we hope schools might be for everyone. And so that was like, we sort of came to the table with that shared set of convictions, and then with this like complementary skill set, and we just kind of set out into the world of schools saying like, well, it wouldn't be nice if we could just go out there and see what good work is that we can learn from. And it kind of spiraled from there. We didn't set out to write a book together. That was not in the cards, at least for the first few years. It was more like, let's write up some cases and let's do some exploration in this vein because we both care about it.
Wow.
Yeah, and then I would add to that, I really lucked out. Sarah is a very talented professional in her own right, and she was a very talented graduate student when she joined our collaboration. She already had a master's from Bread Loaf and had been published in the Washington Post, and had been a teacher, and just had and has a remarkable sort of narrative eye for observation and for writing those things up. So I really sort of lucked out as the person who was in theory, like the, older person in the collaboration. And then, but then when we got to writing, the fact that we both thought of ourselves as writers was a little challenging because, you got to figure out how each sentence should go, and what sounds good to one person's ear might not sound so good to another person's ear. And, we've produced a lot of words together over the years. And so that took a little bit of practice and norming. So we came out in a great spot, and we've always been friends, but I don't want to hide the fact that there were some complexities along the way.
Well, I think that's great. At our school, we actually value watching. We love having people come to Slate School and do their work. And, we learned early on that we get much more out of somebody rehearsing in front of us than someone actually performing. And so, sharing the mistakes or the difficulties along the way is just a really important part, I think, of learning for kids and for me. So I appreciate you sharing that.
I would just add to that. I think it actually connects to the content of our book to some extent in our work. But, everybody talks a lot about teaching collaboration as this 21st century sort of soft skill that we care about. And I often sort of return to my experience learning to collaborate with Jal when I think about teaching collaboration and teaching the young teachers I work with now to teach collaboration to their own students, as like, it's not just this in the abstract set of skills that you can master, right? It's actually like every partnership, every particular collaboration and set of sustained group experiences requires like negotiating the same things over again. You can't just be like, oh, well, I was a great collaborator with that other person, so, I'll be fine now. Check, I've mastered that one. Because, co-authoring with Jal, like we said, it took a lot of work to learn how to do it well. And I've co-authored with other folks, and it's a different set of dilemmas. So it's, even though there's some shared processes you can use. So I think it does connect to some pieces of deeper learning as well.
Definitely. And I think also, you're talking about that sort of that jigsaw of you providing something and Jal providing something, and how those two things fit together, but how there's necessary overlap necessary overlap. So, I think maybe it might be important for people who do not have the dog-eared copy of your book in front of them to sort of think just a little bit out loud about what deeper learning is. So maybe you could give us a definition of that, and then we could jump off from there.
Sure. We talk about deeper learning as emerging at the intersection of mastery, identity, and creativity. So mastery is developing knowledge and skill. Identity is coming to sort of see yourself as someone who does the work in a domain. And creativity is not just sort of taking in knowledge, but making knowledge. And so if you think about any kind of pursuit in life that you're good at, be it, cooking, gardening, volleyball, whatever it might be, there's probably some sort of cycle in there where you develop some knowledge and skill, you begin to think of yourself more. There's a famous study about this with really good swimmers, and it said that they like to play in the pool when they were little kids. And then somewhere around 8 to 12, they moved from like, I'm someone who swims to I'm a swimmer. So that's kind of the identity piece. And then there's the sort of creativity piece. So like, if you're a cook, like you don't make the same things every time. You like your repertoire kind of gradually grows and expands. And so that's kind of how we think of deep learning. One other thing I might say is, deep learning is sort of not just being able to see the surface, but being able to see the underlying structures. So not just being able to label the parts of a biological cell, but understand the functions of the cell, or what would happen if a particular piece of the cell were missing. If you ever listen to Car Talk, that show on NPR where people call in with the problems with their cars, and
I'm shocked. I know what you're talking about, but I do.
Click and clack.
They talk to Click and Clack, and the person's like, well, it tends to squeak, and they say, well, what kind of squeak? What does the squeak sound like? Is it more when it rains? That's like a conversation between someone who can only see the symptoms and someone who understands the underlying system. So that's kind of deep learning.
Beautiful. Yeah, it seems like just so much more malleable. Like it allows for so much more understanding of the whole. Beautiful. So I guess there are some people that would say, or that might argue, that deeper learning is just another way to value skill over content. What's the response to that?
I could start on that. There are people who say that, and I think Jal and I would strongly disagree, at least as we understand deeper learning. So even just to go back to the example Jal just used, like you can't understand systems and you can't think in terms of concepts. Hi, Alex. Alex or Nico, can't tell who it is. We'll just play tag. This is like a metaphor for our collaborative relationship, because when we started our work, neither of us had children, and now between the two of our respective families, we have 5. So there's been a lot of that in the last 12 years. What I was going to say is, like, you need to know some stuff in order to be able to do things with the stuff. So, for example, if you're trying to understand the way that the human body works, if you're in a biology course, if we want to get more school and academic about it, on the one hand, the way that most students learn about cellular biology is a lot of rote memorization, right? Like you memorize the parts of the cell, your teacher quizzes you on how you label those parts of the cell. And that's about it, right? So that is the opposite of skills over knowledge. There's not much skill. There's just a lot of raw knowledge there. However, if you actually were to go deeper and to be able to, for example, engage in an exploration of like, what would happen if the mitochondria malfunctioned? Like let's explore the series of diseases or the ways that the body might respond to that. All of a sudden, you're in territory where you are applying knowledge, you're exploring possibilities, you're leveraging an argument, maybe in service of producing something, right? But you can't do any of that without the knowledge, right? You have to know that there is like raw, undigested stuff you have to be able to then like sort of hang together to form concepts, and then those concepts allow you to produce new knowledge, for example. And so I just think it's a false way to think about anything, to think that like knowledge doesn't have a place in deep learning. I think quite the opposite. The problem is more when teachers or learners are only just kind of regurgitating knowledge or following algorithms without sort of conceptual parts to it, and possibilities to be creative, to use the knowledge in service of producing something else.
Great. I think that clears that up for the whole world, because I think that I think it's important that we get ahead of that a little bit, because I think it's easy for people to be in love with their own program, what they feel works for them. And that's why I wanted you to talk about that. And then also maybe we could move around through some of the different kinds of environments that you witnessed, that you observed, and talk about what were some of the stark differences in the models that you saw?
Sure, and I think I could probably connect this one to the last one. So I think one of the reasons that we foregrounded kind of mastery along with identity and creativity is that, Sarah and I really care deeply about mastery, like developing actual knowledge and skill in a domain. That's not the only thing in life, but it's a pretty important thing to shoot for. And so we saw some things in progressive education or project-based education. We saw one day where the head of school was really enthralled with, the kids are going to learn chemistry by making a cake. You could learn chemistry by making a cake, but not only if you just made the cake and you never discussed the underlying chemistry that went into the cake. We like this sort of combination of virtues because they include the sort of more romantic ones like identity, creativity, passion, but also the sort of more, the more disciplined ones like mastery. And so I think we were really, we had started our study looking in core classes in English and math and history and science. And there was occasional sort of, great teaching, but on the whole, there were a lot of worksheets and there were a lot of recall kind of tasks. And there was a lot of we would say why are you here? Why are you doing this? And they would say, I don't know, for college, I guess, ask that girl over there. She's the one who understands what's happening in this class. That just seemed really different. So if you talk to us a year or two into our study, we were really depressing people to talk to. And then, then it dawned on us, this is not the only thing that's happening in schools. And there are also elective classes and extracurricular spaces. And often if we ask students, where should we go if we're looking for deeper or powerful learning or things you really understand or think you'll remember a few years from now, those were often the spaces that they pointed us to. So Sarah, do you want to take over there and talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of some of those spaces?
Sure. Yeah. So that was one of the happy surprises, I suppose, of this work is that, like Jal said, we did not go in to this work planning to study what we ended up calling kind of peripheral spaces in schools. And it ended up being central to one of the biggest ways we spent our time and questions we explored was what makes these spaces different? Because like Jal said, we would ask kids and we came up with all these proxies for what we thought, the ways we thought kids might understand what we were after. So we'd ask them when does time fly by? When are you doing something during school or after school that you talk about beyond the parameters of that thing, that you take home to your dinner conversation, that you willingly practice on your own? And inevitably we'd hear things like, oh, well, that's my school newspaper or a school play or my football team or, all of these, or sometimes elective courses, green engineering, music, sound production. So we ended up spending a lot of time in those spaces. And one of our questions became what is different about the assumptions and the structures and even the pedagogy of those spaces from core courses that there are many amazing versions of, but for the most part, the most dominant pattern was these kind of lower level, less engaging ways of being. And so we came up with a list of those that we could talk about. I mean, one of the key ones, of course, is around choice and kids electing to be in those spaces. And that matters, right? But There's also, beyond just like electing to show up, there's also in a lot of those cases a lot of choice embedded inside of the activities they're doing, right? So if you are producing a school newspaper, you are probably part of a student team that's making decisions, like consequential decisions about what's included, what's excluded, what do we want to explore and why, what do people want to read about, what matters in this community. You're making choices about how to represent the thinking and the explorations you've done. So it's not, who works with whom on what. All of those are choices that are embedded inside the environment. So that's one. And then another really big one, and then Jal, maybe I'll toss it back to you, was the idea that in a lot of those spaces, kids are producing something greater than the sum of the parts. So if you are mounting a production of a play, you can't do it without all of the different students playing all of the different roles, and not literal roles like characters on the stage, although that too, but the people behind the scenes who are doing the lighting, who are doing the scenery, who are directing the work. You just can't, there's no way that one or two sort of superstar students can carry it. And in fact, what's being produced couldn't happen without everybody playing the particular interdependent roles that they're doing, and without some coordination across those roles. And that's just fundamentally different from the way that most academic courses are organized, right? We have a very individualistic, meritocratic, everybody takes the same test at the same time and gets their own score. There's not a lot of effort usually in core classes to do something where students are actually genuinely interdependent in what they're doing and genuinely working towards something that no one of them could produce on their own.
I love that you're talking about the theater piece too, because I love that whole section of your book. That's actually, my whole background was in theater. I did it for 20 years before I became an educator. And I will say to anybody, I used to think that, theater was the most collaborative art form until I became an educator and had a class full of kids who I was collaborating with them. But I think the theater is a really powerful place to learn a lot about yourself as a learner. And I think it's a great place to learn about the world. And I just think it's a really powerful spot. And I love that you talk so much about it. And yet you're really not turning away from that mastery piece. There are tremendous understandings that happen in that kind of work. I was wondering, when I think of the performance aspect of the theater and the whole process, how you talk about how theater takes you all the way through Bloom's taxonomy, to get really teacher geeky, but I wonder, do you think that the personal project piece kind of has all of those pieces as well? So do you think it ticks all of those boxes from early questions to final presentation?
You mean like a project-based learning?
Well,
project?
I mean, yes, a student having a project as part of their learning experience that is something that they've generated and chosen, and they take it through the entire arc of learning from, I wonder about this, to here's what I really think you need to know about this, and here's why you need to know it. And I'm wondering if you think those two spots, and I don't mean that one would take the place of the other or take the place of all other kinds of learning, but do you think it hits at the same stuff?
It's definitely possible. A couple of the students in the show said, we feel even more passionate about improv because we're writing our own lines and we get to bring sort of more of ourselves into it. Like you can interpret the role, but still like somebody else wrote the script. And so when kids name a passion project, in a sense, like sometimes it can be even like more connected to what they most fundamentally care about. So in that sense, it could be, more powerful. On the other hand, we took this idea from our colleague David Perkins of playing the whole game at the junior level. And Dave's idea is kind of like for, in Little League, for example, it's not like a year throwing and a year catching and a year batting, and then like you get to play a whole game when you get to graduate school or something. Mm-hmm. It's like you got 7-year-olds like running around on the field. And as you could see from my little youngsters coming in and out, like it's not always pretty, but they do get some sense of like why you would be playing baseball and how the whole thing works. And so I think that is a really good analogy for theater. I think that's a big reason why we found a lot of this in this extracurricular realm, because what was happening in the realms was more closely aligned to the work that happens in the world. Like, the kids weren't ready for Broadway, but they like do basically like understand what actors do. They understand all the you know, things that happen in a show and how the parts fit together and so forth. And so project-based learning kind of can be that, but there also are projects that just have no like equivalent or like real reason for being, you know, like we're studying this, so at the end you should make a poster and display it. Like,
well, I don't know why you would ever tell somebody what they should do, right? I mean, if it's
I'm just saying, like,
but yes,
no one does that. Like,
yes.
that's not a real thing.
Yes.
I think I think often if projects like can borrow from some of the grammar of some real things, like, this is what a good essay looks like, this is what a good podcast looks like, this is what a good documentary looks like, then it can get grounded in a way that like helps with the mastery piece.
But wouldn't I want to go on to something else, but I think that, you know, your project's not complete unless you can communicate it, right? So I think you have to be able to communicate what your passion is. Otherwise, I think it has less. I mean, certainly not.
What do you think, Sarah? You went back to teaching and did some project-based learning with some seniors. Like, you know, maybe you should talk about that a little bit.
Well, I wanted to jump back to the like individual project, because I see that I see schools that are sort of project-based learning curious, doing something along the lines of like individual passion projects that kind of runs in parallel to some of the other curriculum. And I certainly have seen a lot of high schools, even since my own high school days, that have like juniors and seniors do some version of a senior project that's quite independent. And then last night I happened to go to my second graders passion project exhibition, virtual exhibition. And so this is not so much about project-based learning in general, but I think when you have students doing individual projects, I think what Jal said is true, right? There's like every kid gets to decide something they care a lot about, and that is inherently motivating in many cases. And you lose a lot of things because, number one, you lose the possibility for real meaningful collaboration, and that piece around we are building something together, because kids are not necessarily going to choose the same things. And more importantly, maybe even than that, is you lose, at least in a classroom context, you lose the possibility of examining exemplars in the discipline together to construct a shared sense of what is good work. So for example, my second grader, he loves surfing. We live in Southern California. His father's a surfer. So he did a project on teaching, he made a video about teaching friends how to surf, which was awesome. I was very proud of him. He did a great job. But one of the things that was missing, no disrespect to his teachers who are working incredibly hard in this crazy distance learning context, was that he was making effectively a how-to, like an informational video, but because every student in the classroom was working on a different topic and making a different product, so not everybody was making informational videos, there was very little capacity for him to look at examples, to unpack them, to think about what made strong ones, what made ones that weren't so strong, to look at his own work and apply those criteria to it, to refine it, to look at other people's work and get inspiration. So I think in the best project-based classrooms, there actually often is either a shared topic or area of inquiry and some choice in terms of what you do with it. Or in some cases, there's a shared format, like we are all making documentary persuasive films, and there's a huge array of choice around what you do it, but we can together unpack this as a genre and think about the features that make it strong. Because I think when both the product and the process are open-ended, even when you're scaffolding kids through various steps, and they're doing things on their own, even if there's time for it during school, I really think that there's something lost there. I'm not convinced that is going to guarantee rich, powerful learning for most kids.
I hear you, and I have to say, I want you to come to Slate School. Because I think that some of the things that you say are really important and right, and but one of the things that we see happening here quite frequently are very surprising collaborations. Like I had one kid studying coffee, very interested in coffee, the making of coffee, the history of coffee, all of that. And another child studying the Deccan Plateau. And never did it occur to me that those two projects were going to overlap, but they did profoundly. And the two of them began working together in such an incredible, beautiful, collaborative way. So I think things like that do happen when you're really looking for it. And I think it's the job of the facilitator. If you're in a school that does this kind of work, you have to be looking for the collaboration, and then you also have to look for the opportunity for rising tides raise all boats. Bobby's doing a video. He's doing a how-to video. You might not be doing a how-to video for your project right now, but let's take a look at some how-to videos. So in the future, if this is the format that you decide is the most optimum for sharing what you've learned, you'll have some skills in your back pocket. So everybody would stop and learn a little bit about that. So I think there are ways to do it, but I think you're right. If you ignore that, if you don't make those, really hard turns to find the collaborative moment and to find the mastery in all of the presentations and in all of the expressions, you would lose. It would be meaningless. So I totally agree. So I want to get back to how do we take this parallel grammar of extracurriculars and bring those into the regular core learning environment? What are some things that we can do?
So we also had that question, and I think that this idea of like, what is the sort of whole game in this field is a really helpful starting point. So, if you take something like science, for example, a lot of science is like read about Newton's laws and then like do this experiment in quotes that will like demonstrate to you that like one of Newton's laws is true. And like, no scientist would do that. Like, why would you do a quote unquote like experiment on something that is like very well known? Scientists experiment on the unknown, and they draw on what is known to figure out how they would shape their explorations into the unknown. And so back to your skills and knowledge question, it doesn't mean that like you just like set the kids free to like experiment on whatever they want without trying to build on what knowledge is there. But it does mean that like the point of science is to like investigate the world and learn things about how it works. And so, we saw a science class in a pretty high poverty Boston school. And the question was like, it was a methods of scientific inquiry class. And the kids got to choose what they wanted to do their experiment on. And they picked things like, if you wore, if you listen to music while you're studying, does your efficiency go up or down? And like, that's not like a world shaking question, but it's a real question. Like you could imagine the answer being yes, you could imagine the answer being no, you could imagine the answer being, it depends on who you are, what sort of music, what kind of work you're doing. Like there's a lot of possibilities there. Yes. And so through that, you can teach statistics, p-values, like there's a lot of things that can be taught. And in fact, that they had started by trying to like teach them about the scientific process over the course of the semester and then do the sort of experiment in the last month of class. And they'd sort of discovered over time they were better off just like let the kids like plan what it is they want to do from the beginning and then like gradually teach the pieces sort of through it as they worked on the process. So there's a kind of science-y example. Sarah, do you want to give like an English history example?
I can, but I just want to circle back just to something you asked us earlier. So within that example, right, the scientific inquiry course, you can see at various points, just to sort of put a finer point on it, where students are practicing skills and where they're also having to build knowledge in order to do the work, right? So they are practicing the skills of posing scientific questions, considering alternative hypotheses, like looking for credible sources and so on. But they're also, in this case, like they had to actually do a little tiny mini literature review on what does the world know about this particular question. Has there been any other scientific work done on, whether music increases productivity? And if so, what does it say? Are there conflicts in the studies that have been done? Are there gaps in it? So there's some actual knowledge that they needed to build in relation to their question. And then things like running, if you want to like try to figure out correlations, you need to know something about statistics and how you determine correlations and the strength of correlations. So again, there's content in there. It's not contentless, and it couldn't be, but the content in some cases overlaps for all learners. In some cases, it's specific to the questions that they've posed and the choices they've made. So I wanted to circle back to that. Yeah, I think, so I'm an English teacher, or I'm a former English teacher. I still identify very strongly as an English teacher, and now as somebody who works with a lot of English teachers. And I think English is a really interesting case when you think about this whole game question, because I think English language arts as it's not really discipline, as a subject of study in high schools or in K-12 schools, basically looks to a whole lot of different whole games, a whole lot of different professional fields, right? In some cases, it's like literary scholarship. In other cases, it's filmmaking. In other cases, it's like, for example, debate often shows up in English classes. So you're looking to the traditions of law, potentially. So there's just a lot of creative writing, right? I mean, there's so many different whole games that you might be looking to that I think for English language arts teachers in particular, what matters is to think about the tradition that you want your kids to sort of look to for in a given unit or topic or strand of your curriculum, right? So if you are, for example, trying to get your kids to engage in really robust debate and eventually present persuasive arguments in front of, at your city council meeting locally or something like that, that strand of argumentation is something that you can actually look to the world to learn about, right? It's not just like sitting in the Common Core standards that students need to be able to present compelling arguments using ethos, pathos, logos, like every eighth grader in the world at least pays lip service to, but you can actually watch real debates in the world. You can watch presidential debates, you can watch lawyers presenting a case. I mean, there's so many different ways. So I think the best teachers I've seen are doing that very carefully, are kind of thinking about these sort of professional examples that sort of embody the best of the discipline, and then having their students work toward, name what those attributes are, and then try to do them themselves.
Can I just add a little thing to that, which is another thing we noticed about the really powerful teachers we observed is that they kind of set the world askew by 10 degrees. They just kind of twisted it a little bit. There was a guy in a math, science, STEM school, think Bronx Science or junior MIT, and he was teaching philosophy. And so he was teaching Bacon and skepticism. And so the assignment was okay, you just wrote up this paper for your science class on this scientific hypothesis you explored. What would Bacon say about whether or not you can actually perceive reality this way? So he was sort of undermining the purpose of the school through the assignment, and kids loved it. And in the English example, there was a teacher who was again teaching pretty high poverty kids in a regular city school, and they were studying Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Coates had written an essay in the Times, and they just spent a whole day just unpacking this 11-paragraph essay in the Times. And the content of the essay was it's very relevant to the moment again, but are there appropriate times to use the N-word? And does it depend on the race of the speaker, and so on and so forth? And Coates was arguing that there are. It's situational and contextual. This was 2013. I don't know if you would argue that today. And so the kids were really interested in the substantive question. They had a lot of opinions about that. But then there was okay, we've taught you in school for 6 years that an essay should have a thesis statement, and that the first sentence of every other paragraph should connect to the thesis statement. And okay, this guy's a real writer, this is a real essay, it's in the New York Times, it doesn't have any of those things. So like, what about that? And so like the essay as a form, it turns out like doesn't have to have a thesis statement at the end of the first paragraph, doesn't have to have the topic sentence leading every other paragraph. There's a lot of ways to write an essay, and which way you choose depends on what you're trying to do and why. So he was kind of like letting the kids in on the world of what actual writing looks like, using a Black author writing about a very relevant issue. And so he was saying like, look, you could be like this guy, and you have a lot more choices than people have given you up till now as you think about your writing.
That's a great example. I love that example. I also think English is such an interesting subject because you can teach everything in English. You know, if you're writing an essay, you know, you probably have to have a persuasive essay, especially you have to, you know, you might want to have a good working knowledge of statistics so that you could talk about different ways numbers are presented. Obviously, you're communicating. Sometimes you have to have an understanding of history of other writers. I just think, and it kind of gets to this other piece that I want to ask you about, and it's this idea that so much of school is siloed. And I think all of the examples you've mentioned today, every single one, regardless of what you were, you know, where the example was targeted, it was an example of non-siloed teaching. And with siloed teaching epidemic in our country, I just wonder what's your feeling about how we can find ways to move away from that.
Yeah, I think we are strong proponents of deep disciplinary teaching when it makes sense. Like the traditions of the disciplines have, right, and the ways of knowing that go along with them can be rich and important. And most of the problems that most of the skilled humans in this world are working on in the 21st century do not like limit themselves inside of those disciplinary boundaries. I mean, it's a vastly small number of people who are still like exploring, you know, pure scientific questions in a lab. And a lot more people, for example, I was just giving the example yesterday to some students of a project that was done in 11th grade in the school network where I work kind of proximate to. And the question that drove the project was, why is there so much gun violence in the United States and what can we do about it? Two seemingly simple questions with enormously complicated answers, but there's just no way in the world you could explore those questions well and fully without crossing disciplinary boundaries, right? Like you have to look at it politically, you have to look at culturally, you have to look at sociologically, you have to look at anthropologically, you have to look at it historically. I mean, all of the things, and obviously there's math in there as well, like you were saying. And then the piece around what can we do about it, which I love as an addition because it connects to that piece around creativity defined as kind of agency and action, is I just think that those are the questions that sort of eat away at people who experience the world. And so exploring them in ways that take advantage of the different disciplines. Like I don't want to speak for you, Jal, but I do think there is value in some of the depth and the richness of the ways of knowing that our academic disciplines have accumulated through the years, right? Like being able to think historically with the perspective taking and document analysis and the kinds of questions historians ask and the ways that they ask them and explore them. There's a whole tradition there. And I think we deprive our students if we do everything so interdisciplinarily that we never expose them to that. And I think that like the ways our schools are structured are so, to your point, they're so siloed within those disciplines. Half the time, they're not even really doing justice to those disciplines in the first place. And the kinds of questions that are really compelling and connected are necessarily going to bring them across those boundaries.
Yeah, if I could just build on that a little bit, I agree. The tree of knowledge is like a web that is highly interconnected. So like, I don't know, we're still homeschooling my second grader and he's like studying the American Revolution, which leads to Ben Franklin, which leads to electricity, which leads to batteries, which leads to the Constitution, which leads to governance, which leads to, like that's the way the world actually presents itself. And yet we, in school, we just like divide everything up into these little boxes. And then we're like, why aren't the kids interested in what we're doing? well, we just like sucked all the juice out of it. And then we're like, why, then we're to the teachers, like, why aren't you more engaging? Like we gave them a sort of like impossible problem when kids like, come at it. A school leader I really like said, if you ask kids like about their interests, they'll say like basketball and video games. And if you ask them their questions, they'll say things like, how is the world going to end? And, a group of adolescents, like they did a question protocol, and that was the like sticker voted question that the kids were most interested in. And so then they like organized into teams, and you got a team working on infectious disease and nuclear war and like an asteroid and climate change. And then you have like a presentation day where they're each sort of displaying the likelihood of their scenarios coming true. Like kids have all kinds of questions. And if we adapt to those, if we start with those questions, I just think we'll get a lot further. And those questions do not tend to be, or almost never, sort of disciplinary questions. They're always cross-cutting questions of some sort.
Yes. You saw some amazing teachers. You have a great chart in your book that sort of describes the comparison between the deeper teachers and the traditional teachers. Very revealing. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about the disparities there, what you saw that was most significant.
Sure. Well, first off, we should say we're careful not to put anything like on the teachers. Like most teachers are teaching the curriculum they have within pacing guidelines, state tests, teacher evaluations, like nothing is organized in ways that would support the kind of teaching we're looking for. Our mentor, David Cohen, who passed away this past year, said to us a couple of years into the project, like, so you're like studying deeper learning. Have you found any yet? There are no incentives for it. And we were like, we have a little bit here and there, but they were, really confident, transcendent teachers, or they were in really specialized schools where there was space and support for it. So I just wanted to preview with that. Yeah,
I'm glad you said that. Teaching could be a very lonely and scary job. Maybe very difficult. So even for the most brave. So yeah.
So I think the big thing is just it started with different goals. So to go back to this thing that we've been talking about, like, is the goal to like cover the material, or is the goal to sort of induct the learner as someone who could do the work of the field or ask the questions the field was asking? I remember a teacher who told us, he was teaching in the Bronx, and he said, I'm an American history teacher, and this course is supposed to go from 1750 to 1950. And like a month into school, the kids got really interested in the fact that the founding fathers owned slaves, and like, what did it mean that our like Constitution was written by a bunch of slaveholders, and like, how could we be like professing fealty to this Constitution if those were the conditions, and so forth. And he said, if I had been a younger teacher earlier in my career, I would have said like, we don't have enough time, we need to move forward.
Yes.
And as a more experienced, confident teacher, he was like, wait a minute, like, we have kids who are like actively interested in this critical question, like the sort of contradiction of racial sin on which this like nation that's in theory about justice and liberty for all was founded on, for all. And so they just like stopped off, and they like spent some real time investigating that question. And, he like cut something later, or, sped up a little somewhere else. But like, he just sort of made the choice that like, this is where the energy and interest is. So I'm really going to go there. So I think that was another big dimension. Sarah, do you want to pick up from there?
Yeah, I think like to circle back to earlier, there was also just a different sort of stance around like in relation, the way that the deeper teachers position themselves in relationship to knowledge. So, right, like the traditional form of teaching is professing, right? Like there's some fixed body of knowledge here that has been discovered by the experts, quote unquote, and the job of the teacher is to somehow be the kind of middle person between that knowledge and their kids, and they're dumping it into the the empty slates of those kids' minds, to mix my metaphors. Now there are very few teachers I think who would swear by that as a model, but that's the cultural milieu we live in, and the water we swim in, and the millennia old tradition of teaching has kind of conceptualized teaching that way. And so I think the difference, a lot of the teachers that we saw who were doing something really different, they saw themselves more as sort of intermediaries between a dynamic body of knowledge, like there is something that people continue to contribute to that I can help my students engage with directly. I can help them understand like the ways of knowing and the big questions that animate that field, but also I see my students as real possible contributors to the field. Like they have something real to say, right? Even if we're reading Hamlet and we are the 9 millionth set of students to read Hamlet since the 13th century or whatever, my students might have something to say that nobody's ever said before, and they might have connections to make between this and our world that nobody's ever made before. And so rather than playing like what's in my pocket, there is a right answer and your job is to figure it out, it's more of a like, let's together inquire into questions that matter to us. The teacher obviously is positioned ideally as somebody who has more experience posing certain types of questions, answering those questions in certain ways, but they're not going about it with a like, there is a fixed thing that I want you to know at the end of this. And so it's just a different way of sort of positioning yourself in the classroom. And it's a much more inviting way, especially for adolescents, but for students of all ages who are really sensitive. I think that they know immediately in the classroom whether their job is to sit and listen and receive and then regurgitate, or whether there's actual real opportunities for them to engage authentically.
And whether, the other people in the room think they're capable of having unique, amazing thoughts that could change everything, and we do. So I think this is a great segue to, because I think some of what you're talking about is apprenticeship in the classroom. And I think this is a good segue to talk about how we can help ourselves as educators, and we can help other educators by this model of the apprenticeship of observation. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, Sarah or Joe.
I mean, yeah, I can start because I think about it a lot in my current work. So we actually call it the San Diego Teacher Residency now, but it's a pre-service preparation program. But that term, the apprenticeship of observation, right? It was coined by Daniel Lordy like 40 years ago. But the idea is like most teachers in the U.S. at least learn how to teach mainly by sitting in classrooms for 12 or 16 years. Because in the absence of high quality sustained teacher education as some kind of intervention, like we just kind of default to assuming that teaching looks and feels whatever it was we experienced ourselves as learners. And in most cases, that is the kind of sit and get model, right? And so whether or not you might want to engage your students, you might believe that your students can do good work, but if you don't have other models and practices to disrupt the patterns that you yourself have experienced, mostly what you're going to do is replicate what you saw. So I think the idea of apprenticing novice teachers in spaces that allow them to actually really see in a sustained and very granular way, what does powerful teaching look like? What does deeper learning look like? What does it look like to have a community of kids who have real agency, who are working together on issues of consequence in ways that allow them to feel really empowered and lead to real consequential learning? Like, I don't think there's any substitute for that in terms of teacher education. I think we can sit in a circle and talk about it, and I suppose we could watch it on videos. That's one step further, but like living it and experiencing it seems to me like the most important thing of all. And so that's the program I run. It's designed as a full year residency where my novice teachers are partnered very deliberately with teachers that we think are doing all the things we just described. And then of course, we're also kind of equipping them with sort of theories and ways of talking about and making sense of what they see and experience in their classrooms that help them sustain the commitments that they make, and then hopefully bring them into their careers and become eventually the folks that other people can learn from. So ideally, we can try to disrupt the system bit by bit by kind of changing the models that people encounter.
I think that's a really sort of profound point. I think we came to think that people who hadn't experienced what we were talking about, they might talk about like 21st century skills or the like 4 C's or the 6 C's or like whatever the jargon was. But like if they hadn't, it's like if someone like took a language class, but they'd never been to like a country where people spoke the language. I mean, if you really want to learn a language, like don't take 5 years of language in a school, like spend 3 months in a place and you'll get it. And so I think the kind of immersive thing that happens in the program that Sarah runs and other similar programs, like you just can't replicate that. I teach a deeper learning class at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I think it's a pretty great class and students have pretty great experiences. But sometimes when the panelists come to the final presentations, like occasionally like a student will say something in a presentation and a school leader who's like led a school like this for a long time will just have this sort of like puzzled, quizzical look on their face. And I'll be like, yeah, you're right. Like if I could just have them sit with you for 3 months, that would be worth more than my graduate school course, because they would, experience it in a sort of, immersive way that it's really hard to do in a university context.
Yeah. But I guess that's a challenge, right? I mean, it's a challenge to have programs like this. And I'm just going to say, I think this is one of the reasons that your book is important. I think the Ted Dintersmith book is quite important, because they give us a little bit of what it would be like to travel around the country and see other educators. Yeah. I think there are a lot of teachers in schools who don't even get release time to see the teacher across the hall. And for the teacher across the hall to come in and sit and say, wow, I really loved what you did on this moment, but you missed this over here, or did you ever consider doing this? And I think I think that we'd be so much better for that if we had that kind of across the hall collaboration at least. So I know we have just, almost no time left, but I just want to say that there may be people that are listening to this program and they have either in their own classroom or they have the potential in their district to begin to make some profound changes toward the kind of deeper learning that you're advocating. And I'm wondering what would be the first move? What would you recommend to these brave souls?
I think the first thing I would recommend is trust yourself and trust your relationship with your kids. So if someone is telling you to like go through this curriculum at that pace, and you're looking at the kids in front of you and their eyes are sort of glazed over and you're wondering like, what is going on underneath that screen? Like, who are these people and why are they here? And what are their lives like? And how might some of that connect to whatever subject we're studying here? Like trust those questions. Those are good questions. And then, start small. Like it seems like you're being observed, but you're not really. Like it depends where you work, I guess. But for the most part, like schools are what we call loosely coupled, meaning that no one in the administration has enough time to actually like watch what's happening in all classes all the time. So you actually have a lot more power than you think. And if you're, in particular, if your class goes well, if your students and parents report that, Mrs. Johnson is a really good teacher, then if Mrs. Johnson isn't quite like following the rules of the curriculum, like nothing's going to happen to Mrs. Johnson if and then I would say just seek out similar souls, that there may be other folks in your environment who have similar inclinations. Margaret Wheatley says there's sort of no problem in an organization that can't be solved by connecting the organization to more of itself. So there's often somebody there with whom you could, just sort of build your courage and start to try things. And then consistent with our point about apprenticeship, I do think that sort of networks and people are really important. And so if you're just starting on this journey, like I remember once I gave a talk and a 11th grade physics teacher came up to me and was like, what does this mean for like 11th grade physics? And I was like, I don't know. I don't teach 11th grade physics. Like what you need is like an 11th grade physics teacher who's like a little further along on this journey than you are. And you need to have a conversation with them. You need to get in sort of like a regular networked communion with them. And if you did that, then like, you might read a book together or look at a website or, there's no shortage of resources out there. So I think courage, trust yourself, relate to your kids, find a friend.
I like it. Sarah, something to add to that?
I like those. I mean, obviously we've talked about this, so I agree with all of those. I could add two little ones to it. One is just like ask your students. Like I think depending on how sort of deeply your students and the families and the community and the context, you may have some intuitive sense of what your kids are curious about. But it's pretty profound when we have my novice teachers just do simple empathy interviews with the kids in their class. Like, what do you care about? How do you spend your time? What are you curious about? What excites you in school? What do you remember that you've been excited about in school? You can almost draw a line between anything they say and what the discipline or field that you'd like them to learn if you can be creative enough. And so, it's always then a question of how do you, when you have a diverse group, as you necessarily will, no matter how racially, socioeconomically diverse they are. Like if you ask kids, what are you interested about in, like you're going to get a lot of different answers. But, I think then trying to find crosswalks between what you want them to learn, what you feel they need to learn, and what they care about. I think that's always a good starting point. And then the High Tech High Network is very much all in on a practice that I think is really promising, which is like exhibitions of learning. So I think when teachers, either together or on their own, hold themselves accountable from the very start of a unit or a project or a sequence of learning or a semester to the idea that at the end of that time, there is going to be some kind of public presentation of learning to as authentic an audience as you can muster. And in some cases, the most you might be able to do is to present to the class next door or present at the school assembly that happens once a month on Fridays. But maybe you can get yourself into a local venue and invite a more public audience, or maybe you can invite in some experts in the field that you're working in to take a look at the work, or maybe you can rent the local theater and perform the thing you did. So there's obviously lots of different ways you could imagine exhibiting, but I think it's not going to guarantee good work. But I think that for teachers and for students, knowing that their work is going to be seen by people that they care about and people that know about what they're working on and people who could potentially be impacted by the work, I think it just necessarily raises the bar for the type of work you want kids to do. Because, if they're turning an essay into you at the end of or taking a test, and all that's ever going to happen is you're going to grade it and give them back and then put it in PowerSchool, it's like profoundly inauthentic, other than the grades, which some kids care about. So I just think, like, if you set that up for yourself and you're like, okay, 3 months from now, come hell or high water, we are going to have an exhibition at the community center. I've already rented it. I've already sent out the invitations. I've already said something about what we're going to be doing. I think all of a sudden, then the quality of the work that you're hoping and supporting kids to produce is going to shift, because the work is public and has some impact.
Maybe the disaster of what COVID has been actually gives us a little something in this moment too, because now not only can we present, in the gym or at the local theater, we can present to the world, we can present to people everywhere, and I think it might start to give kids a sense of the importance of their ideas. They don't just live right here in this room. I want to ask one more question if you have time. Do you both have time? Thank you. Because I think we're kind of edging toward it. And I just wonder, you're kind of edging toward that, Sarah. How do we assess deeper learning? What's promising in that field? Because I know I know that's challenging, to be transparent about, what kids are learning.
She said, Sarah, you want to go first?
Either of you is jumping at that.
Joel's doing the nodded thing.
Right now, nobody here is getting excited about that question.
It's just a really hard question. I mean, I think in a, we did a chapter on International Baccalaureate, and what we liked about the International Baccalaureate model was I think the credo is something like it tries to measure what you know rather than what you don't know. So like in history, for example, rather than writing, having a series of multiple choice factual questions, you might have to write an essay on a topic that you choose, and it would be judged on use of evidence, argumentation, etc. So I think those kinds of assessments are better. I think in the long run, we should just sort of think much more kind of radically about assessments. Like, I think the thing about the theater example is like the assessment is the play. Like the line lands or it doesn't, it's funny or it's not. The person is in the light or they're not. Like the fields give us internal standards of what is good, and people strive for them. I mean, there's some danger even to that. Like you want to emphasize the process as well as the final product. Like, you can be a team and you can do everything right, and you can lose because you're playing a better team, and you can still be proud that you basically like played a good game.
But the better the rehearsal, the better the play every single time. And like
definitely.
The more deep, the more mistakes, the more all of them.
So I guess in a sort of ideal world, we would just have a much more kind of variegated like ways of kids demonstrating their knowledge and skill. And then those things would get packaged into some sort of portfolio that students submitted to the colleges at the end. And that would sort of show the various things that they could do. And that would replace the A to F or A to A plus on a 5-point scale with AP credit. Like we would just drop all of that. And like you would just sort of turn in, and there is this, like you probably know, the Mastery Consortium is like trying to develop those sorts of transcripts and so forth. And so I think that would be a better direction.
I can add just a slightly more granular piece, which is something we work on a lot with my student teachers, which is like learning how to help students articulate the standards that they want their work to live up to, right? So like literally like co-constructing rubrics with kids, rubrics loosely defined. So words that describe the characteristics of high quality work in whatever vein you're working in. But often that's done like looking at examples, right? So okay, you're going to be writing an op-ed. Let's read a bunch of op-eds. Let's engage with them. Let's notice the common features. Let's think about which ones resonate with us and which ones don't and why. And gradually, let's try to articulate like what are the characteristics of a strong op-ed. And then you use that to self-assess your own work, to provide critique to other people's work. And then eventually, like you're assessing your own work on the standards that you yourself have generated and developed. So, and then, presumably if a teacher then is involved in the assessment as well, you're working from a shared understanding of what quality is. And so I think even something as simple as that changes the game a lot for students, right? Because it's not arbitrary. Like, I mean, I've used rubrics before. Everybody always told me when I was a novice teacher, you've got to use rubrics, and I do understand why. But it was always me creating them, or somebody else created them on the internet. Or my school gave it to me, or it came from the standardized test, and kids had no idea where those standards of quality came from. And honestly, teachers often didn't either. And so it was very like assessment was a fairly meaningless activity other than the sorting and ranking that of course like exacerbates competition and a sense of self-worth or a lack of self-worth. So I wonder if like assessment, the more we can engage kids in the process of assessing their own work and noticing their own growth and that like reflective piece, I think the closer we're going to get to assessment that is useful for the sake of continued learning rather than useful only for sorting kids and ranking them and deciding who gets to go to elite colleges and so on.
I mean, you
Maybe
could
we should-
connect that to the, oh, sorry.
No, you go.
You could connect that to the sort of apprenticeship argument we were making before. That like, as you become more skilled in a field, you go from like the standards of the field control me to like, I understand what good work is. So like, ultimately, like the kid should be able to like look at somebody else's podcast someday. Like if this really went well, they would like study a bunch of podcasts, they would make a podcast, they would do it for a while, and someday they could like teach podcasting. And so like to get to the like teaching podcasting, you have to not just be good at your own podcast, you need to have a sort of more general sense of like what makes it good. And so if we could use assessment in that fashion, it would be so much more consistent with learning. And it would also be so much more, the state tests, you know, like a committee meets and another committee and another committee and another committee, and then like something gets created, and then like that's holds for 5 or 10 years. But like, you know, we didn't have podcasts like 10 years ago in the way we have them today. Like the world keeps changing. And so like this invites people into that process of the world changing.
I love that. I think that's great. I think what I was the one thing I was going to say is that I think too much of assessment it just doesn't include reflection, like real meaningful reflection. Not like I did a good job. I felt like I spent a lot of time on this. I think my project was good, you know, things like that. But actual, you know, what I hope to do in my project was this and that because I wanted, you know, whatever outcome based on what I had seen before is good. So I think maybe, I don't know, maybe we say assessment and reflection. I don't know, but I think those are some great ideas. And I think this was an evening of great ideas, and I appreciate so much you taking the time to come and talk with us today. It has been a great honor to chat with you. I hope you both have a wonderful early evening, and I will just close this the way we close every meeting at Slate School, which is to offer everyone some positive rice, and hope everybody is doing well, staying safe, and being well. So thanks again for coming, and so long from Slate School.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.